couple of weeks ago when I preached the first sermon on forgiveness, I had someone after worship come up to me and say, I have a question, Pastor, and I think just to give you a quick glimpse, I'm pretty sure it was a little bit humorous, but this person said, my spouse and I have been married for a lot of years now, and I am pretty sure that I have forgiven that person more than 490 times. So what do I do now? Because, of course, we've been talking about forgiveness, and we put up on the wall here 70 times 7, this famous saying of Jesus when he's asked, how often should we forgive? Is 7 times enough times? And Jesus says, not 7, but 70 times 7. Of course, Jesus was trying to throw out a big number that would remind us that we shouldn't be keeping track. So I suppose this person had sort of missed the point because they were counting past 490. If we are keeping track of how many times we have forgiven someone, the reality is that we probably aren't actually working toward forgiveness. And we need to be people of forgiveness. I want to share a story with you this morning, and I don't do this very often, but the story is so good that I took it wholesale from someone else. It's a theologian. His name is Richard Rohr, and he tells this story that I want to share with you. He says, I want to share a personal story of forgiveness that happened in my family near the time of my mother's death. She was lingering on the threshold and for several days had been talking about a mesh she couldn't get through. I was sitting by her bed telling her how much I would miss her. She said she wanted to hear that from my father, whom we always called Daddy. Of course, Daddy had been telling her for weeks. So Daddy came over and effusively told her, I am going to miss you. She replied, I don't believe it. I couldn't believe my ears. I said, Mother, you have a few hours left of life. You can't say that. And yet she persisted. I don't believe it. Daddy redoubled his efforts. I ask your forgiveness for all the times I've hurt you in our 54 years of marriage, and I forgive you for all of the times you've hurt me. I said, Mother, isn't that beautiful? Now say that back to Daddy. And suddenly she clammed up. She didn't want to say it. I said, Mother, you are soon going to be going before God. You don't want to come before God without forgiving everybody. She said, I forgive everybody. I said, but do you forgive Daddy? And she became silent again. Then Daddy jumped in and said, Honey, I never fooled around with any other women, and we all knew that. She even said, well, I know that. My siblings and I still don't know how Daddy could have hurt Mother. But of course, any married person knows that there are many little ways a couple can hurt one another over 54 years of marriage. Then I said, Mother, let's try this. Put one hand on your heart, and I'm going to pray that your heart gets really soft. I placed one of my hands on hers over her heart and held her other hand and started kissing it. After about a minute, she said very faintly, that melts me. I said, what? When you kiss my hand like that, now I've got to do it. And after a pause, she continued, I'm a stubborn woman. All of my life, I've been a stubborn woman. Well, Mother, we all knew that, I said. Now look at Daddy and you tell him. So she looked over at him, and she didn't call him Daddy as she usually did. She spoke his name and said, Rich, I forgive you. I prompted her again, Mom, the other half, I ask your forgiveness. She started breathing heavily and rapidly. Then she summoned all of her energy and said, Rich, I ask your forgiveness. A few more moments of labored breathing, and she said, that's it. That's it. That's what I had to do. And I said to her, Mother, do you think that that was the mesh? She replied, it's gone. The mesh is gone. And God, I pray that I mean this forgiveness from my heart. Then she said, referring to my 2 sisters and my sister-in-law, tell the girls to do this early and not to wait till now. They'll understand a woman's heart and the way a man can hurt a woman. Mother was so happy then and fully ready for death. If we know that we're called to forgiveness, then We have to be people of forgiveness like her. And yet, it can be hard. And today we heard another story of forgiveness as well. John read from 2 Corinthians. It's a letter of Paul's. And Paul admits that he has struggled to forgive, and yet he calls the church to forgive. And it's an interesting story because all he says is him, and so it could be read in a sort of general sense, but it is a specific story. Paul is referring, we don't know to whom, because all he does is refer to them in the pronoun, but it's clear that it's a singular person because at one point he says, they've suffered enough punishment, it's time to forgive them now. And yet, Paul clearly also has struggled. This is 2 Corinthians, right? And that's only called that because it's the second letter we have to the Corinthian church in the Bible. What we don't know is whether there were previous letters. And a lot of people don't realize this. They think that because we call 1 Corinthians, that it's the first letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. But it's likely not, because Paul, in that 1 Corinthians letter, references things that he has written to them previously and said to them previously. And so we know that there was a relationship going on already. And so even though we call them 1 and 2 Corinthians, there likely were other letters. And that means that time has gone on, and we're not sure when this wrong happened. And we're not even sure exactly what it was, as I say. And yet Paul has worked toward forgiveness, even though he undoubtedly, like this woman, could be stubborn. Today, I want to talk a little bit about forgiveness through the lens of both of these stories. And I first want to say this, that when we seek to work toward forgiveness with someone, we have to begin to see them as a person and not as an enemy. And this is true for Paul. Paul, especially, as I mentioned, says in this short passage that we read that this person was punished and they have received what they should have received, and now they should be welcomed and loved. And we do not love enemies. It's what Jesus calls us to do, but if we view a person as an enemy, the likelihood is that we will not love them. The call that Jesus makes is not so much that we should love someone and still view them as an enemy, but that we should love people, and when we love them, we cannot view them as an enemy anymore. That's antithetical. It's impossible. We cannot both say, you are my enemy, someone that I wish evil on, that is completely opposed to me and I believe is unworthy of anything good, and still say I love them. We are called to instead transition from seeing enemies to seeing people. And part of that is what we talked about in the first week on forgiveness, which is that we need to learn to forgive ourselves. And part of learning to forgive ourselves is learning that we are not perfect. And when we then realize that we are not perfect, and when we realize that our enemy is not so much an enemy, but another person who is not perfect, it changes the way we view what they have done. And clearly, this mother struggled with that as well. She must have felt that she was the perfect spouse, while her husband was not. And she was unwilling to accept his apology because she, strangely enough, seems to see her husband as the enemy. I won't accept your forgiveness. I'll forgive everybody else, but I won't accept your forgiveness, and I won't forgive you. Secondly, I love this story where Richard takes his mom's hand and says, you need to let your heart melt. We are people who need to allow our hearts to melt in order to forgive. This means that we need to be people who have empathy and tenderheartedness. And again, these first two are closely related because you cannot see an enemy and have empathy for them. You have to see them as a person, and then when you see them as a person, you begin to have empathy for them and to be more tender-hearted toward them. We have to allow our hearts to melt in order to be people of forgiveness. We are often too hard-hearted. It's a phrase that is used in the Bible. In the Old Testament, God calls the Israelites stiff-necked. It's the same term. It's this unyieldingness, right? We want to harden ourselves and batten down the hatches for the battle that we foresee when someone has wronged us. If we can just get back at them, if we can lob something else at them and strengthen ourselves and be hard, then maybe we'll win. But instead, forgiveness is about softening ourselves and letting our hearts melt. Our hearts melt when we realize the power of what Jesus Christ has done for us. It's the same as Richard holding his mom's hand and kissing her other hand. You can imagine Jesus showering you with kisses to melt your heart, saying, I forgive this person, I love this person, they are not my enemy, why do you still view them that way? When our hearts soften, then I think the third thing about forgiveness is that we need to feel the hurt and allow ourselves to be hurt and grieve. And this is a hard thing for us to do. You see, forgiveness takes an immense amount of strength in order to accept the hurt that has come into our lives. You see, when we live a life of retribution, we deny that hurt, and instead, like I said, we strengthen ourselves. We get ready for battle. We try to figure out how we can get back at the person. We try to keep that pain at bay. But to stay strong in that sense is the world's version of how we should react to being hurt. But kingdom principles tell us that we are strong when we embrace the hurt and pain of our lives. And we say it this way, that when we are weak, that is when we are strong. And the life of forgiveness is one in which we do not pursue the strength of this world, which says strength is shown in getting back at that person. But we say strength is shown in acknowledging that I am hurting. But that I'm not going to let that hurt make my life worse. I'm going to let it be redeemed by God. The woman in the story doesn't want to forgive her husband. And Paul probably had a hard time, as I said, forgiving this person as well. But he does say that he's come to a point of forgiveness. And of course we hear this woman's story, and she eventually comes to a place of forgiveness. And both of them acknowledge the hurt. The woman ends the story by saying, tell your sisters not to wait to do this. Women know the hurt that a husband can cause differently than anyone else does. She acknowledges the hurt that she has had from this loving relationship. And she moves to forgiveness by embracing that pain to some extent, letting her heart melt and being vulnerable and embracing the pain. Paul, too, encourages us to move to the point of acknowledging what has hurt. Paul says, what wrong has happened. I felt that hurt, but I'm ready to move on to forgiveness. So that we then can embrace this phrase. It is this: God doesn't love us if we change. God loves us so that we can change. And this is what I said to the young people during children's time, which is that we need to be people who forgive others so that they are free to change. We do not forgive people so that, or if they change, sorry. We don't say, I'll forgive you when you're different. We forgive them so that they are free to potentially change and become better. And that is absolutely true of God. God does not love us if we change. God loves us so that we can change. We cannot hold out our love to a person until they are the way we want them to be. We must love them so that they can allow God's power to change them into who God would have them be. And so 70 times 7 is about chances. And it feels like so many times, although, as that person here in church told me, they feel like they've gotten beyond that point. If we only had to love them a person who has hurt us, when they were going to change, we wouldn't need the number 70 times 7. Because we would only need to forgive them once, and that was when they somehow became the perfect person we wanted them to be. But instead, we're told that forgiveness is about chances. Give them not 7 chances, but 70 times 7 chances, so that they have a chance to change. It doesn't mean, when we say we do not love someone if they change, but we love them so that they can change, it doesn't mean that we don't expect change. But it does mean that we won't withhold our love and forgiveness until they change. We love them so that they can change. And the other thing I want you to notice about that phrase is it says God does not love us if we change, but loves us so that we can change. It is all centered on God. And as we talk about forgiveness today, a lot of it feels centered on us, right? How can we forgive? But the reality is that we need to realize that forgiveness is centered around God. It's not actually we who forgive. It is God working through us to forgive other people. Forgiveness isn't really our work. It is God's work. When we forgive someone, it's not about us. It's about showing people that there is a God who forgives. Because if I can embrace the hurt that someone has given me and not seek to get an eye for an eye, but instead let things go and let them grow and change, it shows that there is a God who can change people's hearts, who can melt people's hearts in the same way that my heart has been melted. And it shows that we know God. And so I finally want you to consider this today. 70 times 7, I think, isn't really about them. When Peter says, how many times should I forgive? 7 times, is that enough? And Jesus says, no, I tell you 70 times 7. I don't think it's about them. That person may hurt you only once. It may be a really big hurt. I have some of those people in my life. I don't know about your lives. They may only hurt you once, but you may have to forgive them again and again and again. Because forgiveness is not only about allowing them to change, it's about allowing God to change us, right? Again, it's about that melting heart. And it may take more than 490 times to move to forgiveness with that person. And again, if you're counting, you probably haven't gotten to forgiveness. If you're keeping track, you're just not there yet. And that's okay. Because here's what you also need to know about the fact that forgiveness comes from God. And I forget how often we don't say this, and yet it should be something that we say every week in church. You are not God. And so, while God can forgive all wrongs, you may take more time. Because you are not God. God forgives. And we work toward forgiveness. And we use the tools that I've mentioned, right? Allowing our heart to be softened towards someone, viewing them not as an enemy, but instead as a person who is made up of both good and bad, right? And when someone does something bad to us, it's easy to just view them as bad, period. They're all wrong. They're just a terrible person. But instead, if you don't put those adjectives on them, but instead just see that they are a person, you can move toward forgiveness, realizing that they do both good and bad. They just did a bad thing to you. If we give ourselves time and space to let God's love work in us, we will move toward forgiveness. So Charlie, of course, always the prophet in our midst, spoke true words. He said, sometimes I need some time to work toward forgiveness. And that's absolutely true. And it's absolutely okay. And I'm the same way. Sometimes I just need some space before I start talking with that person again. And if they've really hurt you, do not feel that you need to rush to forgiveness in order to be loved by God. Allow God to work in you and in them. But we do need to make space and time to forgive. Too often we are the hard-hearted people who simply will not forgive, even though we come to church every Sunday and talk about forgiveness and we acknowledge that God has forgiven us. We may reserve and hold back that same forgiveness to someone else who needs it. It may take you a while to say, I forgive you, and to really mean it. But I find power in one other smart theologian, and that is John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement. He is famous for saying he had a moment when he had felt like he had lost his faith. And he was talking to a friend of his saying, how can I even preach at this point? And I felt that way this week, honestly. You know, there are places in my life where I have not forgiven, not truly forgiven certain people. And I thought, how do I get up and talk about forgiveness when I'm not 100% there? But John Wesley's friend said to him, when John said, I don't have faith, how can I preach? And what should I preach? His friend said, what you do is preach faith until you have it. And then once you have it, you will preach faith. And I think that this is true of forgiveness as well. We preach or talk or give forgiveness until we have reached that point of forgiveness. And then because we have forgiveness, we will continue to give it to that person. It's the same theory. And so I think there is power in saying to someone, I forgive you, even if we're not 100% there yet. And we just do the 70 times 7. We keep saying it. I forgive you. I forgive you. I forgive you. It'll begin to melt our hearts. It'll begin to allow the space in us to make that statement true. Because we know forgiveness through Jesus Christ. And we're called to be people who show Jesus to the world. And we need to show that there is a forgiving God out there. And so that means saying to people, you are forgiven, even when we ourselves are not 100% to the point where we have forgiven them. We need to acknowledge to them that God is a forgiving God and that they are deserving of forgiveness. Forgiveness is what we need, it's what everyone needs, and we can be agents of God's forgiveness in the world if we see people as people, not as enemies. And if we let our hearts melt so that we can embrace the hurt and become vulnerable and make space for God's forgiveness to work through us. And then do it again and 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 again until the kingdom comes here on earth. Amen.